Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into ancient Egypt. Imagine walking the sun-drenched streets of an ancient city, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread wafting from the bustling bakeries. You're surrounded by grand pyramids, the hum of merchants bargaining, and the distant sound of the Nile gently flowing by. But here's the kicker. You probably wouldn't survive this. Without modern conveniences, technology, or even basic hygiene, the odds of you making it out of a day unscathed would be slim. Still, you're here for the history, so we'll take it slow and easy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and what time it is where you're at. Always curious to see where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Egypt, the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and yes, bread. But not just any bread. In fact, bread played such a vital role in Egypt that, for centuries, it was more than just food. It was currency. You might picture coins as the go-to method of trade. But Egypt had something far more interesting, something far more flowery, pun intended, to offer. Loaves of bread. Yes, that humble, toasted morsel we take for granted was once the backbone of an entire economy. Before the invention of money as we know it, societies needed a way to trade goods and services. And in ancient Egypt, bread was that exchange medium. Forget shiny coins or bulky gold bars. Here, bread was the currency that fed not only the people, but also their entire trading system. Imagine being paid in loaves of bread after a long day's work. You could use that bread to trade for something you needed, like a jug of water, a new robe, or a hand-carved wooden bowl. The economics of ancient Egypt were built on these exchanges, with bread serving as the bridge between work and reward. You might be wondering, why bread? Well, that's the part that's fascinating. Unlike coins, bread wasn't something that could be easily hidden or hoarded. It was tangible, essential for survival, and highly perishable, making it a perfect, though somewhat risky, form of currency. And for the ancient Egyptians, bread was more than just a filling meal. It was a critical part of the economy, culture, and even religion. Historians still argue whether bread was used exclusively for transactional purposes, or if its role evolved with Egypt's shifting societal structure. What's clear, however, is that bread was essential for ancient Egyptians, not just for survival, but for thriving in a world without paper money, digital transfers, or anything that we would consider modern. Remember how we just talked about how bread wasn't just food, but the currency of choice in ancient Egypt? Let's dive deeper into how this grainy wonder became the bedrock of the Egyptian economy. Picture it now. Streets filled with bustling merchants, the constant buzz of haggling and exchanging. But what was truly moving through these markets wasn't gold or silver. It was loaves of bread. It's hard to imagine today, where we toss coins around like they're nothing. But back then, bread was worth its weight in gold, or more accurately, worth a loaf's weight in grain. Bread was central to Egypt's economy, far beyond just being a staple food. In a society as large and complex as ancient Egypt, everyone needed to eat. And bread was the most reliable way of making that happen. For the average person, it was the go-to meal, the fuel that powered daily life. But for the state, bread was an asset that tied together food production, labor, and taxation. forming the economic structure upon which the entire civilization stood. In fact, the temples played an incredibly important role in the bread economy. These were not just places of worship. They were centers of economic activity. Temples controlled large-scale grain production and acted as both the spiritual and economic heart of Egyptian society. Priesthoods oversaw the distribution of bread, sometimes to the workers who constructed the great monuments of Egypt. Workers would receive bread as payment for their labor, bread that was produced by the very grain harvested by other workers. The loop of bread as currency was a beautiful example of how the Egyptians intertwined their economy with their religion. After all, it wasn't just a gift of sustenance. It was an offering to the gods themselves. Temples also served as the first forms of banks, holding the grain that could later be exchanged for services or goods. And because grain could spoil if not properly stored, the temples also controlled large grain silos, ensuring there was a constant, stable supply of the key commodity. Bread could be traded for things like clothing or tools, but it could also be used as an offering to the gods. To the ancient Egyptians, bread was the very essence of life and divine favor, a point illustrated by the frequency of bread-making rituals and offerings found in ancient texts. Historians still debate whether temples held an actual monopoly on the bread trade or if independent bakeries existed outside of temple control. What's clear though, is that these institutions held enormous sway over Egypt's food supply, and by extension, its economy. The blend of religious and economic power was pivotal in sustaining Egypt's impressive longevity. As bread started to become more than just sustenance, the rituals surrounding its creation and distribution began to take on spiritual meaning. Think of it like a modern-day ritual. But instead of handing over a card at the checkout counter, you were offering a loaf of bread to get your hands on whatever you needed. The more grain you could supply, the more bread you could generate, and therefore, the more influence you could wield in Egyptian society. As we move deeper into Egypt's ancient bread economy, let's zoom in on the fascinating role that temples played. These were the true powerhouses of Egypt, not just religious sanctuaries, but monumental economic hubs. You might picture grand, towering stone structures and the mesmerizing chants of priests. But what's often overlooked is how temples essentially acted as the first centralized economic institutions. Here, bread wasn't just a byproduct of agriculture. It was the very currency that fueled Egypt's vast network of trade, labor, and wealth distribution. The temples held vast stocks of grain, sometimes more than entire villages could produce in a year. These massive grain reserves were a critical part of the temple's influence and the broader economy. They stored surplus grain from the harvests, carefully preserved in large, sealed silos. This grain wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. It was actively traded, exchanged, and distributed in the form of bread to laborers, workers, and the common people. And here's the kicker. This wasn't a random act of charity. It was part of a grand system where bread was used to pay workers for labor on monumental state projects, like the construction of temples, pyramids, and other architectural wonders. But the role of bread in Egypt wasn't just limited to the temple economy. It extended far beyond the walls of these sacred places. The temples acted as a kind of intermediary between the pharaoh and the people. The pharaoh, as the supreme ruler, controlled the grain reserves stored in these temples, distributing bread to the people in exchange for loyalty, taxes, and service. This created a direct link between Egypt's food production and the royal power that ruled over it. If the temples had enough bread, Egypt's economy thrived. If the bread supply faltered, well, You can imagine the consequences. Historians still argue whether the royal administration had full control over the grain reserves or whether local temples exercised autonomy in the distribution of bread and grain. What we do know, however, is that temples were more than just places of worship. They were the economic engines of Egypt. And, in many ways, these religious institutions were not only the guardians of the gods, but also the keepers of the bread economy that powered Egypt's social structure. The grain harvested in Egypt's fertile Nile Delta wasn't just any grain. It was the lifeblood of the entire empire. The river, with its regular flooding, provided the fertile soil for bumper crops of wheat and barley, the key ingredients for bread. This made Egypt one of the most stable agricultural societies of the ancient world, with an economy that depended not only on the products of the Nile, but on how efficiently these products were distributed and used. But let's not get too lost in the grandeur of these temples and their massive grain silos. The real story of bread in ancient Egypt was in the hands of the everyday people. These were the workers, farmers, and bakers who actually grew the grain, milled it into flour, and shaped it into the loaves that would be exchanged for goods and services. By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. Bread and grain weren't just symbols of sustenance. They were the very lifeblood of Egypt's economy. To understand just how crucial bread was to ancient Egypt, let's take a step back and consider the immense role the Nile River played in all of this. It wasn't just the water that flowed through Egypt. It was the foundation upon which the economy was built. Without the Nile, there would have been no grain, and without grain, no bread, meaning the entire cycle of bread-based currency would have never come to fruition. The Nile was more than just a river. It was the world's ancient superhighway. Every year, the Nile would flood its banks, depositing rich, fertile silt onto the surrounding land. This made Egypt one of the most productive agricultural regions of the ancient world. Imagine a landscape where the ground is naturally rich in nutrients, and farmers only need to sow seeds after the floods recede. No need for artificial irrigation or worrying about water shortages. The river provided all the nourishment needed to grow staple crops like wheat and barley, which were then harvested and transformed into bread. But here's the catch. While the Nile made agriculture in Egypt incredibly efficient, it also made Egypt heavily reliant on the river's seasonal patterns. If the flooding was too little, the crops wouldn't thrive. If the floods were too intense, they could wash away entire harvests. Yet, despite these uncertainties, Egypt's rulers managed to stabilize the economy by controlling the grain reserves and carefully monitoring the flooding patterns of the Nile. This helped ensure a steady supply of bread and grain, and in turn, a steady supply of currency. Historians still debate whether the flooding of the Nile was the main determinant of Egypt's prosperity, or if other factors, like the skill of Egyptian farmers, played an equally important role. Regardless of where scholars land on this, one thing is clear. The Nile was the engine that powered Egypt's agricultural success and, by extension, the bread economy. This heavy reliance on agriculture and the Nile was one of the reasons why the Egyptians developed such sophisticated methods of grain storage. They needed a system to preserve grain during times of plenty so that it could be used in times of scarcity. The state controlled vast granaries to store surplus grain, ensuring that Egypt would never run out of its most precious resource, bread. But let's not forget that bread itself wasn't just produced by anyone. The actual process of bread making was labor-intensive and required skill, which is another reason why bread became such a valuable commodity. Bread wasn't something you could just whip up on a whim. It took hours of preparation, starting with milling the grain into fine flour. Once the flour was ready, it was mixed with water, yeast, and salt to form a dough. The dough was then kneaded, shaped, and left to rise. Only then could it be baked into golden, crusty loaves. So, as you can imagine, there was a whole network of workers involved in this process. Farmers harvested the grain, millers ground it, bakers baked it, and traders distributed it. Each person involved in this chain contributed to the overall economy, using bread as both a product and a form of currency. At this point, you've learned about the essential role of the Nile in sustaining Egypt's economy and bread as a central pillar of trade. But let's now zoom in on how this early system of currency worked in practice. The process of producing bread may seem like a simple, everyday task. But in ancient Egypt, it was a far more intricate affair, one that became tightly intertwined with Egypt's economy and social order. The bread-making process wasn't just about producing loaves. It was an economic engine that kept the entire system running. Grain, after being harvested from the fields, would make its way to the granaries, often overseen by temple officials. The grain was carefully stored, protected from spoilage or pests. And once the time was right, it was used to make bread, which then circulated as the most widely accepted form of payment. But there was a catch. The process wasn't as straightforward as it sounds. Bread, unlike money today, was highly perishable. One loaf might have a shelf life of only a few days, depending on the climate. This made bread both a currency and a product with a very short window of usability. This brings us to the fascinating early systems of grain storage. Ancient Egyptians had developed sophisticated methods for storing surplus grain to protect against famine or bad harvests. In times of plenty, grain could be stored for later use, allowing the temples or government to maintain a reserve. In years when the Nile's flooding was insufficient, these stores could be tapped to keep the economy running, ensuring that people still received their bread-based pay. However, grain storage was not foolproof. If there was an error in managing the supply or a catastrophe, like a locust invasion, the results could be disastrous. In those instances, bread, the currency, would lose its value, leading to a collapse in the local economy. Historians still debate how far back the Egyptians had developed these grain storage systems, with some suggesting they were perfected much earlier than we realize. Either way, it's clear that the management of grain was one of the fundamental pillars of Egypt's success. Without careful storage, bread wouldn't have been able to act as a reliable currency, and the very structure of ancient Egyptian society might have crumbled. But the bread-making process didn't stop with the grain. Millers, bakers, and traders were all involved in turning raw grains into loaves that could be distributed throughout the land. Millers were highly skilled workers, grinding the harvested grain into fine flour. Without them, the bread-making process wouldn't have been possible. And then there were the bakers, who took the flour and turned it into bread using fire and skill. The baker's craft was valued so highly that, in some periods, the baking profession was considered almost sacred, tied directly to the gods and the afterlife. The process itself became ritualistic, and bread wasn't just food, it was an offering, a divine sustenance meant to ensure prosperity for the living and the dead alike. But bread didn't just stay within the walls of Egypt's temples or homes. Bread was essential in Egypt's trade systems, too. It was a valuable trade good that could be exchanged for other commodities, both within Egypt and with neighboring regions. Traders could barter bread for oil, spices, and even luxury goods, making it an incredibly versatile form of currency. Unlike the gold and silver that only the wealthy could hoard, bread was democratic. It touched the lives of everyone, from the lowest laborer to the pharaoh himself. Historians still debate the extent of Egypt's international trade during the bread economy era. While it's clear that Egypt traded widely, there's a bit of mystery surrounding how bread fit into those larger exchanges. Some suggest that Egypt's exports, like papyrus, linen, and grain, helped cement its position as a major power in the ancient world. If bread could be traded as currency, it stands to reason that it might have been one of the most coveted exports. Now that you've gotten a sense of how bread worked as a currency and the significant role it played in Egypt's economy, let's zoom in on how bread was used as a payment for labor. It's easy to picture bread as something that was traded in markets or served on dinner tables, but in ancient Egypt, it was often the primary form of compensation for work. This was especially true for the workers who built the massive temples, tombs, and pyramids that still stand today, symbols of Egypt's enduring legacy. Imagine this. You're a laborer in ancient Egypt, maybe working on the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, a project that took decades to complete. At the end of a long day, instead of receiving coins or silver for your work, you're handed a loaf of bread. Sounds a bit strange, right? Yet, for thousands of years, this was a reality for many in Egypt. The economy didn't have a formalized wage system like we do today, but labor was rewarded with food, specifically bread. This practice of paying in bread wasn't just for the average worker. It was also common for soldiers and skilled craftsmen to receive bread as part of their wages. But for the laborers working in the fields or on large construction projects, it was mostly bread that kept them going. The bread was, of course, a symbol of sustenance. But it was also a crucial part of ensuring that workers could continue their labor. Without this daily supply of bread, they wouldn't have the energy to keep building the impressive monuments that the Egyptians are so famous for. The economy, therefore, had a direct link between bread and work. Bread wasn't just the currency of exchange. It was also a symbol of hard labor. This link between bread and work was essential in maintaining the flow of construction projects and agricultural output. Pharaohs and the temples relied heavily on this system to sustain large-scale projects, ensuring that the economy functioned efficiently. Now, what's especially interesting here is that the laborers didn't work for bread alone. While bread was their primary form of compensation, they were also sometimes given other commodities, such as beer or clothing. But it was the bread that had the most symbolic weight in this transaction. The ancient Egyptians viewed bread as a fundamental part of life, not just food, but a representation of life itself. And when it was given as payment, it also reinforced the deep connection between bread, labor, and society. Historians still debate whether bread was the only form of compensation for Egyptian laborers. Some argue that certain skilled workers, like those involved in building temples, may have received additional rewards like clothing, housing, or even money. Others contend that bread was the most consistent and widely accepted form of payment, particularly for the lower classes who worked the hardest in agriculture and construction. What's important here is the role bread played in stabilizing the economy, ensuring that workers could meet their basic needs and continue contributing to the grand projects that defined Egyptian civilization. It also meant that the distribution of wealth in ancient Egypt wasn't necessarily tied to gold or silver. Instead, it was based on the daily consumption of a simple, life-sustaining commodity, bread. So, let's pause for a second to appreciate how bread, in all its humble glory, was not just food, but the essential currency of an entire civilization. Without bread as the primary form of payment, Egypt's grand architectural achievements might never have seen the light of day. The economy, the workforce, and the monuments all relied on this daily staple, turning it into something far more significant than a mere food item. As we continue to explore how bread became more than just sustenance in ancient Egypt, let's take a step back and look at how bread evolved into the standard of value in the Egyptian economy. Unlike our modern money system, which is based on paper currency or digital transfers, the ancient Egyptians didn't have coins or bills. Instead, they turned to what was around them: grain, the very lifeblood of their agriculture, and from this, bread was born as the currency that supported Egypt's thriving economy. Bread wasn't just the product of labor or the reward for work. It became an accepted unit of exchange. It was an easy way for people to measure value. Unlike coins, which could be hoarded or hidden, bread was tangible, essential, and highly perishable. This made it a reliable but constantly moving form of currency. People couldn't hold on to bread for long. It needed to be eaten, traded, or exchanged almost immediately, which made it a very dynamic currency. But the shift to bread as the standard of value didn't happen overnight. The first steps towards using bread as currency can be traced back to Egypt's early use of grain as a method of accounting. Records from the time show that ancient Egyptians often kept track of grain production and consumption, as grain was essential to the economy. Over time, this system evolved, and bread emerged as a physical manifestation of the value of that grain, while grain itself could be used for trade. The actual process of transforming it into bread made it a more universally accepted and consumable form of currency. Interestingly, the value of bread wasn't always constant. Its value fluctuated depending on the harvest and the season. If the Nile's flood brought in a great crop, bread became plentiful and cheap. If the floods were less generous, bread would become a rarer commodity, and its value would rise. In many ways, the value of bread was tied directly to the health of the environment, particularly the stability of the Nile's seasonal flooding. Historians still debate whether bread's role as currency was always intended, or if it emerged organically through necessity. Some suggest it was an economic strategy, a way to make sure people had the basic resources they needed to survive. Others argue it was simply a natural outgrowth of Egypt's agricultural society, where the most abundant and essential resource became the cornerstone of trade. Regardless of the origin story, what's clear is that bread filled a vital gap in the Egyptian economic system, acting as the medium of exchange that allowed trade, labor, and taxation to flourish. What's also interesting is how bread, as currency, mirrored the broader social structure of Egypt. Those who controlled bread, typically the royal family and temple officials, held the most power. The pharaohs, with their access to vast grain stores, were able to dictate the flow of bread and therefore the flow of the economy. Bread, then, became not only a symbol of sustenance but a symbol of royal control and authority. It was a currency that reinforced the hierarchy, with the rich and powerful having the most control over bread distribution. By making bread a standard of value, the ancient Egyptians developed a stable system of exchange that lasted for centuries. Of course, it wasn't a perfect system. There were times of famine, social unrest, and economic collapse. But the centrality of bread in Egyptian life ensured that, for the most part, the economy remained robust and functional. This ancient system of using bread as currency laid the groundwork for future economic models, influencing the development of trade and finance in other ancient societies. As we look back at this ancient economic system, it's easy to imagine the bustling marketplaces, the workers milling about with loaves of bread in hand, exchanging them for whatever they needed. It's a far cry from our modern banking systems, but it was a system that worked for thousands of years, all built around something as simple as a loaf of bread. Now that we've explored bread as currency, let's take a closer look at the often unseen labor that went into creating bread in ancient Egypt. It's easy to imagine a loaf of bread simply appearing on the table, ready to be exchanged or consumed. But behind every loaf was an entire network of workers, each contributing a crucial part to the process. Bread production wasn't something done by just anyone. It was a complex, labor-intensive task that required skill, organization, and an understanding of the unique resources available in Egypt. The process started with the grain, of course. But the key to bread production was in the milling. Ancient Egyptian millers played a crucial role in transforming the harvested grain into flour. Millstones were used to grind the grain, and this wasn't a quick process. It took hours to manually grind enough grain to produce the flour needed for baking. Milling was a skill passed down through generations. And while it may seem like an overlooked task today, it was a vital job in the bread economy. Once the flour was ready, the next step was baking. But baking wasn't just a job for anyone who could light a fire. Bakers in ancient Egypt had a special role, often being employed by temples or royal institutions. These bakers were trained professionals who understood the subtle art of bread making. They had to know how to properly knead the dough, how long to let it rise, and how to bake it in the right conditions to ensure that it was both nourishing and durable enough for use in trade. The temperature of the ovens, the consistency of the dough, everything had to be just right. It was a science as much as an art, and the baker's craft was highly valued. But bread wasn't just made for the laborers and the marketplace. In temples, bread was an offering to the gods, prepared by specially trained priests who had a ritualistic approach to bread making. These priests, often associated with the temples, baked sacred loaves as part of religious ceremonies. These loaves were seen as offerings of nourishment to the gods and were considered integral to maintaining the favor of the divine. In a way, the production of bread was as much a spiritual act as it was a commercial one. It's no wonder that the Egyptians viewed bread as sacred. It wasn't just food. It was a way to maintain cosmic balance and ensure prosperity for the living and the dead. Historians still debate whether the role of bakers in ancient Egypt was purely functional, or if it had spiritual significance as well. Some believe that the ritual of baking and offering bread to the gods played a central role in maintaining the stability of the state, while others argue that bread was primarily a commodity produced for economic reasons. Either way, what's clear is that bread making was not a simple or mundane task. It was a complex, multifaceted process that involved many layers of Egyptian society, from the millers to the bakers to the priests. This network of workers didn't just produce bread for the everyday consumer. It was involved in the very machinery of Egypt's economy and religion. Bread was central to both the spiritual and material worlds. The workers who baked and distributed bread weren't just fulfilling basic needs. They were ensuring the survival and prosperity of the entire civilization. So, while we may think of bread as something basic and simple, it was anything but in ancient Egypt. It was a cornerstone of both the economy and the culture, something that was revered not only for its nutritional value, but for its deeper symbolic significance. Without the labor of these unseen workers, the millers, bakers, and priests, Egypt's bread economy would have collapsed. They were the unsung heroes of the ancient Egyptian world, quietly fueling the empire with their craft and keeping the economy and religion intertwined. Now that we've examined the labor-intensive process behind bread making, let's take a step back and look at the larger cultural significance of bread in ancient Egypt. Bread wasn't just something you ate for breakfast or after a long day's work. It was a symbol, a vital part of daily life, and even had strong spiritual connections. Egyptians didn't simply bake and eat bread out of necessity, they elevated it to a higher status, viewing it as something sacred and powerful, often associated with the gods and the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, bread was far more than a daily meal. It was often part of religious rituals and practices. In temples, priests would bake special loaves of bread as offerings to the gods. These loaves weren't just baked with care, they were prepared in a ritualistic way, using specific methods and ingredients that were believed to ensure divine favor. Bread, in this sense, wasn't merely food. It was a bridge between the human world and the divine. By offering bread to the gods, Egyptians believed they were securing prosperity for the people, fertility for the land, and protection from misfortune. In fact, bread's spiritual significance extended beyond just the living. In tombs, archaeologists have found offerings of bread, placed there for the dead to sustain them in the afterlife. Bread was thought to provide nourishment for the soul, ensuring that the deceased would have everything they needed for a peaceful and prosperous journey into the next world. This association with the afterlife gave bread an even more elevated status, making it not only essential for life on Earth, but also a critical part of the cosmic balance that Egyptians believed governed their world. One of the most fascinating aspects of this spiritual connection is how it reflects the Egyptians' worldview. For them, there was little distinction between the material and spiritual realms. Every aspect of life, from the food they ate to the clothes they wore, had both practical and spiritual implications. The act of baking bread and offering it to the gods wasn't just an economic or religious necessity. It was a cosmic act that sustained both the living and the dead. Bread was a sacred sustenance that kept the gods happy and kept the balance of life intact. Historians still debate whether the symbolic role of bread was always as pronounced as we imagine it today, or if its sacredness evolved over time. Some believe that in the early periods of Egyptian history, bread was primarily seen as a basic foodstuff, only later acquiring its deep symbolic significance. Others argue that from the very beginning, bread was always seen as an essential part of both religious and economic life. Either way, what's clear is that bread played an integral role in Egyptian culture and spirituality, making it far more than just a humble food item. Beyond the temples and tombs, bread was also a daily part of Egyptian life. It was a common sight at the dining tables of the rich and the poor alike. For the wealthy, bread might be enjoyed with an assortment of other foods, such as meat, vegetables, and fruit, reflecting their elevated status. For the average person, bread was the centerpiece of the meal, often accompanied by more basic offerings like vegetables and legumes. But regardless of social status, bread remained a constant and essential part of daily sustenance. Even in art, bread was portrayed as a symbol of abundance and prosperity. Ancient Egyptian frescoes and tomb paintings often depict loaves of bread being offered to gods or presented as offerings to the deceased. These artistic representations show just how deeply embedded bread was in the culture, and how it transcended its role as food to become something much more significant, something that connected all levels of society, both the living and the dead, to the divine. As we look back at how bread shaped Egyptian society, it's clear that this simple food was far more than just a nutritional necessity. It was a symbol of life, a link to the gods, and a part of every Egyptian's spiritual journey. From the laborers in the fields to the priests in the temples, everyone played a part in the grand cosmic cycle that revolved around bread. Historians still argue about the exact role of bread in Egyptian religion. Was it primarily a tool for economic transactions? Or did it serve a much deeper spiritual purpose? Regardless of where you fall on that debate, one thing is undeniable. Bread was at the center of Egypt's cultural, economic, and spiritual life, shaping every aspect of the civilization. We've already seen how bread played an integral role in the economy, daily life, and spiritual practices of ancient Egypt. But there's another aspect we need to explore: how bread and bartering worked together in the ancient marketplace. While bread was the core of Egypt's economy, it didn't exist in isolation. In fact, it was a critical piece in the larger system of barter that allowed Egyptians to exchange goods and services in a society where formal currency didn't exist. It's easy to assume that trade simply involved a direct swap of one item for another. But the way bread fit into this system of exchange reveals much about Egypt's culture and how they viewed value. In the ancient Egyptian marketplace, bread was a standard unit of exchange. Unlike today, where we use paper money or coins to trade for goods, Egyptians would barter directly with bread or grain, using it as an intermediary for everything from tools to textiles. If you wanted a basket, you might exchange a loaf of bread for it. Need some pottery for your home? Another loaf of bread would do the trick. Bread, then, was far more than just the food that sustained the people. It was the bridge that allowed different commodities to be traded and for people to get what they needed. What's especially fascinating is how bread's role as a currency didn't just remain confined to the everyday market. It extended into the exchange of more valuable or luxury items. Traders would exchange bread for things like fine oils, rare spices, or luxury fabrics. In a sense, bread was the foundational currency, the bedrock on which all other forms of trade were built. The beauty of bread as currency was its universal accessibility. Whether you were a farmer or a priest, everyone could engage in trade using bread as the intermediary. This level of economic inclusivity is one of the reasons why bread was so integral to Egypt's economy. It made commerce simple, reliable, and universally accepted. Historians still argue about how centralized or decentralized Egypt's bartering system was. Some believe that large temple complexes played a central role in overseeing trade, including bread distribution, while others suggest there were decentralized local markets where bread could be exchanged more freely. What remains clear is that bread was a key currency in these exchanges. No matter how organized or informal, bread remained central to economic transactions. It was more than just a form of payment. It was the anchor that allowed the exchange of goods and services to thrive. The integration of bread into this bartering system speaks volumes about the Egyptian worldview. It wasn't just a commodity. It was an essential tool that facilitated the functioning of society. Bread was so universally valued that it could serve as a substitute for almost anything, and this made bread the perfect economic tool. Think about it. You could exchange a loaf of bread for something as simple as a jug of water or as complex as a finely crafted piece of jewelry. The idea of value, in this context, was grounded in something real, something tangible: bread. Of course, no system is without its flaws. Bread, as an exchange unit, had its limitations. As a perishable item, it wasn't always the most practical form of currency, especially if you wanted to store it or save it for a rainy day. Over time, these limitations would push Egypt to develop more advanced forms of currency, though bread's influence would still be felt for centuries to come. What's remarkable about Egypt's bread-based barter system is its simplicity. Today, we might exchange a wad of cash for goods, or use credit cards. But in ancient Egypt, the exchange was far more direct and tied to the basic needs of life. By using bread, something essential, something everyone understood as a basic need, Egyptians created an economy that was both complex and practical. It was a system that could endure, grounded in the daily rhythms of life and the ebb and flow of the Nile. While we now take for granted that we can buy almost anything with the click of a button or the swipe of a card, ancient Egypt's bartering system shows us just how closely economic transactions were tied to the rhythms of nature and human need. Bread wasn't just food. It was the medium through which a vast and interconnected society functioned. In many ways, bread was the true currency of Egypt, the tool that helped the ancient world run smoothly and kept everything flowing just as reliably as the Nile itself. As we now dive into the relationship between bread and the pharaohs, we see that this humble foodstuff wasn't just an economic tool. It was also a symbol of royal power and control. The pharaohs, as the supreme rulers of Egypt, wielded tremendous influence over every aspect of life in their kingdom. And bread was no exception. By controlling bread, the pharaohs maintained their grip on the population and ensured that their rule was stable. It wasn't just about distributing loaves to keep the people fed. It was about maintaining authority and control over the very resource that sustained Egyptian life. Remember, bread wasn't just something people ate. It was a form of payment, a unit of exchange, and a symbol of divine favor. And who controlled the bread? The pharaoh, along with his temple officials, had the ultimate authority over Egypt's grain reserves. This gave them unparalleled power, as they could decide who received bread and under what conditions. This form of control allowed the pharaohs to manage labor forces, encourage loyalty, and even punish dissent. Bread became a tool of governance, subtly reinforcing the hierarchical structure of society. The pharaoh's control over bread wasn't just about rewarding loyal subjects. It was also about making sure that the kingdom's economy kept running smoothly during times of famine or poor harvests. The pharaoh had the power to control grain reserves and determine how much bread was distributed. By ensuring a steady supply of bread, they could keep the populace from rebelling or losing faith in their leadership. Bread, in this context, became a form of political capital. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh's control over bread was purely strategic, or whether it also had a deeper symbolic significance. Some believe that the pharaohs used bread to reinforce their divine status, as bread was seen as a gift from the gods. Others suggest that the pharaoh's control over bread was purely pragmatic, part of a larger system of resource management designed to keep Egypt's vast empire functioning efficiently. Regardless of the exact motivations, the fact remains that bread was an integral tool in maintaining royal power. Bread also played a significant role in Egypt's military operations. The pharaoh's armies were largely sustained by bread, as soldiers were often paid in loaves of bread during times of war. This was especially true for the soldiers who were stationed far from home, on campaigns that could last months or even years. By paying them in bread, the pharaohs ensured that their armies were fed and ready for battle. Without the regular supply of bread, Egypt's military might not have been able to maintain its dominance in the ancient world. In this way, bread acted as the foundation of Egypt's imperial power. It wasn't just a foodstuff. It was a tool of statecraft, something the pharaohs used to maintain control over both their people and their army. The ability to manage bread supplies was a subtle yet effective way to reinforce royal authority. And as long as the pharaohs had high control over bread, they had control over Egypt. Even more than that, bread was a way for the pharaoh to project divine power. Egyptians believed that their rulers were gods on earth, and by controlling the grain and bread supply, pharaohs demonstrated their ability to command not only the physical realm, but the divine one as well. The act of distributing bread to the people, offering it to the gods, and even controlling who received it was a manifestation of their divine mandate. To the Egyptians, the pharaoh's ability to control bread was proof of his divine right to rule. By controlling bread, the pharaohs ensured that they remained at the center of Egyptian society, both spiritually and politically. It was a subtle but powerful tool of governance that reinforced their status as both rulers and saints. Bread, then, was more than just a means of sustenance. It was a symbol of power, influence, and divine favor, all of which were tightly controlled by the pharaohs. As we delve deeper into the story of bread in ancient Egypt, we must examine the disruptions that occurred when this bread-based economy faced challenges. While bread served as a stable currency for centuries, its role was far from invincible. Economic collapse and famine were ever-present threats, and there were times when Egypt's bread-based system was pushed to the brink. The Egyptians' reliance on the annual floods of the Nile to produce grain meant that any disruption in the river's natural cycle could spell disaster. Imagine this: the Nile, the heart of Egyptian life and the source of Egypt's agricultural wealth, fails to flood, or floods too much. When this happened, the crops suffered, grain was scarce, and bread, the cornerstone of Egypt's economy, became a rare and expensive commodity. The consequences were severe. Bread as currency began to lose its stability, and the entire trade and labor system that had been built around it began to crumble. People who once received bread as payment for their labor now found themselves without enough to eat, and their ability to trade for goods or services was severely limited. At the height of Egypt's power, the state's ability to manage the grain supply was impressive. But it wasn't infallible. If the harvest was poor, or if natural disasters like locusts or droughts struck, the pharaohs could face public unrest and even rebellion. In these times, bread, which had been such a reliable form of currency, became a symbol of a failing system. Its perishable nature meant that people couldn't stockpile enough to weather such crises. As bread became harder to obtain, the stability of Egypt's entire economic and political structure was put to the test. Historians still debate how exactly the pharaohs responded to these challenges. Some suggest that they resorted to rationing bread, controlling its distribution to maintain order. Others believe that in extreme cases, bread might have been substituted by other forms of payment, such as silver or precious metals. What's clear is that, despite its critical role, bread's perishable nature became a weakness. The Egyptians realized that their economy, so dependent on bread, was vulnerable to forces beyond their control. One of the most significant impacts of bread's instability was its effect on the lower classes. The poor, who relied on bread for their survival, were the first to suffer when the grain supply was disrupted. Without bread, they had no currency to trade with, and without currency, They had no means of acquiring the basic necessities of life. This exacerbated social inequality, as the wealthier classes, who had access to more resources, could weather the storm much better than the laborers and farmers. The failure of bread as currency revealed the cracks in Egypt's hierarchical society, where the rich and powerful were insulated from the effects of famine and economic collapse, while the common people bore the brunt of the crisis. Despite these disruptions, Egypt's bread-based economy was remarkably resilient. While there were periods of crisis, there were also moments of recovery. The ancient Egyptians had developed complex systems of grain storage, and even when disasters struck, these reserves helped sustain the population. The ability of Egypt's central government to control and distribute grain in times of crisis was a key factor in its longevity. But, as with any system, it wasn't perfect, and the fall of bread as the dominant currency would eventually lead to a shift in how the economy functioned. Historians still argue about the role of bread in Egypt's eventual decline. Was bread's instability one of the key factors that led to the collapse of the New Kingdom? Some scholars suggest that the decline of Egypt's empire, marked by invasions, internal strife, and economic failure, was tied to the failure of the bread economy. Others argue that the decline was more complex, driven by a variety of factors beyond the reach of bread-based currency. Whatever the case, it's clear that bread, once a symbol of Egypt's power, could no longer hold the system together in the face of mounting external pressures. In the end, the fall of bread as currency didn't spell the end of Egypt's influence or its culture. Egypt's economy eventually adapted, and the use of other forms of currency and trade emerged. But the bread economy was a defining feature of Egypt for centuries. The transition away from bread as currency marked a shift from a more direct, agricultural-based economy to one that would rely more heavily on precious metals, trade, and later, the introduction of coinage. As we look back on Egypt's unique use of bread as currency, it's fascinating to consider its lasting impact on economic systems, even long after bread stopped being used as money. Egypt's bread economy didn't just vanish with the collapse of the New Kingdom. It influenced future civilizations in ways that might surprise you. While coins and other forms of money eventually became the norm, the basic principles behind Egypt's bread-based system would go on to shape how economies evolved across the ancient world. Bread's role in trade wasn't unique to Egypt. Across the ancient Mediterranean, different cultures used forms of barter, often based on staple goods like grain, livestock, or precious metals. The idea of an essential commodity acting as a unit of exchange wasn't a new one. However, Egypt's system of using perishable, everyday items like bread on a large, state-controlled scale was highly advanced for its time. In a way, the Egyptians were pioneering what would later become a more formalized system of commodity money. After Egypt's fall, bread-based economies would continue to influence the way other societies approached trade. For instance, the Greeks and Romans were both influenced by the way the Egyptians used grain and bread to structure their economies, though they didn't adopt it as directly as Egypt had. Roman emperors, in particular, were known for their practice of distributing free grain to the populace as a way to maintain loyalty and control. This grain distribution was very much akin to Egypt's bread economy, with the rulers leveraging bread as both a practical and symbolic tool of governance. Historians still debate whether the use of bread as a currency directly influenced later societies, or whether it was simply a parallel development across various ancient civilizations. Some argue that Egypt's control of bread and grain was a precursor to more complex economic systems, while others suggest that the use of staple goods in barter systems was so universal that similar models were likely to develop independently. It's clear that Egypt's bread economy laid the groundwork for future economic structures. The concept of using a tangible, essential good as currency would resonate across the centuries, even as coinage eventually replaced bread as the standard currency. The principles of barter and exchange, based on essential commodities, remained intact. By transitioning from bread to coinage, Egypt also helped set the stage for the development of global trade. The shift from a purely agricultural-based economy to one that embraced the use of metal currency and later paper money helped create the foundations of the world's modern financial systems. In this sense, Egypt's bread economy was an early and influential experiment in how economies could function through trade, taxation, and distribution. While Egypt may have eventually moved away from bread as currency, its early system helped illuminate the challenges of relying on a perishable commodity to structure an economy. That said, the legacy of bread as currency didn't fade away completely. It just evolved. Bread's symbolic and practical value never truly disappeared from the consciousness of those who studied Egypt's ancient systems. It remained a symbol of the basic economic principles of supply and demand, trade and exchange. The rise of metals, like gold and silver, as the primary mediums of exchange, didn't erase the legacy of bread's economic role. In fact, it deepened the understanding of how tangible goods could be used to reflect value. By looking back at how bread served as both currency and nourishment, it's clear that ancient Egyptians were pioneers in the world of economic thought, long before the modern concept of money was fully developed. As we now shift from the ancient to the more modern world, we can't help but appreciate the cycles of economic evolution that began with something as simple and humble as a loaf of bread. The transition from bread to more advanced forms of currency, such as the introduction of coins, bills, and eventually digital transfers, took place over thousands of years. And yet, the lessons learned from Egypt's bread economy still resonate today. As we continue to reflect on the ancient Egyptians' innovative use of bread as currency, we begin to see echoes of their economic system in modern times, albeit in far more sophisticated forms. While we've traded loaves for coins, and eventually digits on a screen, the essential principles behind how ancient economies functioned remain remarkably similar. From barter systems to standardized currency, Egypt's bread economy laid a critical foundation that has shaped the way goods and services are exchanged, even in the digital age. In modern economies, bread may no longer serve as literal currency, but its symbolic importance persists. Today, we see that basic necessities, like food, labor, and energy, are still at the core of the exchange of value. The concept of using something universally essential, something that every person needs to survive, has evolved into modern economic principles. Just as bread once symbolized sustenance and security, today's commodities, such as oil or gold, represent value in ways that are as universal as bread once was. Consider how markets fluctuate based on the availability of natural resources. When oil prices rise or fall, it impacts entire economies in ways that echo the reliance of ancient Egyptians on grain. If there's an oil shortage, or if countries face disruptions in their supply chains, the price of energy surges, and so does the cost of living. In much the same way that bread prices once dictated social unrest or prosperity, modern global markets remain at the mercy of essential commodities. Moreover, the global trade system today still mirrors the ancient Egyptian grain trade. Though we no longer carry loaves of bread to trade, commodities such as grain, oil, and even water play central roles in how countries negotiate and exchange goods on the world stage. The Egyptians were pioneers in the concept of commodity-based currency, and while they didn't have the sophisticated global markets we do now, the basic principle of trading tangible, essential goods remains unchanged. In many ways, the world of modern banking and finance still has roots that stretch back to ancient Egypt. While we use dollars, euros, or digital currencies today, the idea of storing wealth in something tangible, whether grain or gold, still persists in the way we save, invest, and protect our assets. Financial institutions, after all, operate much like the ancient temples that controlled grain reserves. These modern institutions store wealth, albeit in electronic form, and regulate the distribution of that wealth. Much like Egypt's temples controlled the flow of bread to ensure stability and prosperity. Historians and economists still argue about the impact of early barter systems on the development of currency. Some suggest that Egypt's early use of bread as currency was merely an early iteration of a much broader pattern, while others see it as a unique and revolutionary moment in the history of trade. Either way, Egypt's bread economy was one of the first great experiments in using tangible goods as currency, setting the stage for the trade and economic systems we rely on today. Even in today's world of electronic transactions and complex financial systems, we can look back on the simplicity and reliability of bread as currency with a kind of admiration. It was a straightforward system, so simple, in fact, that it's almost hard to believe it worked for so long. And yet, it did. The fact that ancient Egyptians could rely on bread as both sustenance and currency for centuries speaks volumes about the ingenuity and adaptability of their society. It's a reminder that the most lasting systems aren't always the most complicated ones. Sometimes, they're the simplest, grounded in the fundamental needs of humanity. The simplicity of the bread economy also makes us reflect on how modern financial systems, despite their complexity, continue to rely on fundamental principles. Just as Egypt used the essential commodity of bread to fuel its economy, today's global economy is powered by resources, labor, and the movement of goods, something that is, in many ways, just as fundamental as bread was back then. So, while we may not rely on loaves of bread as currency today, Egypt's legacy endures in the ways we think about value, exchange, and trade. The ancient Egyptians, through their use of bread as currency, created an economic system that was both innovative and deeply tied to the needs of their society. And as we look forward, we can draw a certain comfort from the fact that, in many ways, we've come full circle, still trading in tangible goods, resources, and commodities, just as those ancient Egyptians did with their loaves of bread. As we near the end of our journey through Egypt's bread-based economy, it's time to reflect on the lasting legacy of this ancient system and how it shaped the way we think about currency, trade, and value today. The Egyptian reliance on bread as both food and currency may seem foreign to us, but it served as a model for future civilizations and their own monetary systems. When we look at the trajectory of economic systems, from Egypt to the modern world, it becomes clear that currency is more than just a tool for trade. It's a reflection of what a society values, what it needs, and how it organizes its resources. In the grand scheme of history, Egypt's use of bread as currency was an innovation that paved the way for more advanced systems of trade and money. Yet, even as we've moved beyond bread, its essence remains embedded in our economic structures. Today, we're more accustomed to digital currencies and commodities like gold or oil. But when you think about it, we're still trading essential goods and services. The shift from bread to coins, paper money, and digital transactions may seem like a huge leap. But it's not as different as it might first appear. Just as Egypt's economy relied on tangible, perishable goods, modern economies still depend on the movement of resources to sustain the flow of trade. The story of ancient Egypt's bread economy also offers a reflection on human nature. The need for exchange and value is timeless, as is our reliance on the fundamental resources of our world. Whether it's bread, oil, or gold, humans have always found ways to create systems that allow us to trade what we have for what we need. And just as bread once served as a bridge between workers, temples, and the pharaohs, today's currencies serve as a bridge between people, governments, and global markets. Bread, once the most essential of all currencies, was a powerful tool that reflected not only Egypt's economy, but its culture, religion, and social order. As we wrap up our journey through the land of bread-based currency, it's easy to see how ancient Egypt was ahead of its time. It's also a reminder of how connected we are to the past, even in ways we may not immediately recognize. The simple loaf of bread, something we take for granted in our modern world, once symbolized life, value, and survival in a civilization that has shaped the course of human history. The economy may have changed, and the forms of currency may have evolved, but the fundamental principles that underpinned Egypt's use of bread as currency remain ever relevant: exchange, sustenance, and the inherent value of what sustains us. As we slow down and ease into the final moments of this story, remember that even in today's digital age, with apps and virtual currencies dominating, the cycle of trade and value continues to function on some of the same principles that Egypt's ancient bread-based economy set in motion. In a way, the simplicity of Egypt's system was its genius. It allowed a society to thrive for thousands of years, creating one of the most enduring and sophisticated cultures the world has ever known. And now, as we drift off into slumber, it's interesting to think about how something as humble as bread helped fuel an entire civilization, and how, in the quiet moments of our daily lives, we continue to exchange goods, services, and value in much the same way. Now, as we leave ancient Egypt behind, let's take a deep breath, exhale slowly, and allow the simplicity of life's essentials, just like bread, remind us that we are all part of a much larger, ever-evolving system. We might not use bread to pay for our morning coffee or our rent, but in many ways, we're still exchanging the same thing the ancient Egyptians did: our energy, our labor, our resources, and our most essential needs.